Most of us will likely agree that education shapes each generation for the world ahead. The question before us is whether it has become increasingly feminized, and if so, what that has meant for society. All right. So the claim today, I have to find it written down somewhere so that I can read it properly. I'll have to check the DMs. What was it again? Feminization in education is a net negative for society?
The
Has had
feminization
a
of
net.
education has had a net negative impact on society.
All right. That's the claims today. We have Lorenzo, the affirmative, agreeing with the claim, and Elevator disagreeing, the negative side. We're going to start with Lorenzo steel manning Elevator. So you're going to pretend as if you're smarter and better than she is, and you're going to basically kind of argue against yourself in a sense. So
All right.
whenever you are ready, you have 2 minutes. I'm going to start a timer. I highly recommend, if you can, do the same on the side. I just use Google, or you can use your phone, whatever you feel like. But I will raise my hand like this whenever there's 10 seconds left, just to let you know. So
Okay.
you can always go a little bit over the 10 seconds to finish your point. But whenever my hand is raised, let's try to, just get it over.
Okay.
And I will mute. You just tell me when you're ready, and I'll start my timer.
I'm gonna start now. Okay. So the educational system has become more female dominated, but this is neither because of the boys' struggle nor is it necessarily harmful. Now, girls' educational gains represent the removal of historical barriers rather than discrimination against the male sex. The challenges boys face are better explained by broader cultural, economic, and family changes than by the sex of teachers or classroom culture. Therefore, the feminization of education has been either beneficial overall or largely unrelated to the problems being discussed. The increasing female dominance of education should not, in itself, be treated as evidence of discrimination against boys. Much of the shift reflects the legitimate removal of historical barriers that prevented women from accessing the educational and professional opportunities. The fact that boys may now be performing worse in certain educational outcomes does not establish that the educational system is responsible, and even less that female teachers or a more female dominated educational culture are the cause. The difficulties facing boys today are better explained by broader social and economic developments, like changes in family structures, declining economic opportunities for less academically inclined men, and changing expectations surrounding masculinity. When boys are struggling, the appropriate response is therefore to address those particular disadvantages rather than to blame the increasing presence or influence of women in education. Finally, even if boys are disproportionately disadvantaged in some respects, that does not automatically justify reversing the feminization of education. The increasing participation of women in education is to be viewed as social progress. That's it.
Great stuff. Elevator, do you feel like that was a fair representation of your position?
Yeah, I think that covers a lot of what I'm going to be discussing in my opening. So,
Great.
good stuff.
Let's move over. Elevator, now you're going to pretend as if you're smarter and better, and Steelman his position. I will mute and restart my clock. Just tell me when you're ready.
Sure. So I can start. If I were to steelman the position that the education system has been feminized, I would point to clear metrics that there are more female teachers and students across the world. We see the entry of and popularization as well of feminine coded ideas, intersectional feminism being a household term now. And as I think you briefly touched on, pretty much no one disputes that educating women or females is flat out bad, right? But typically when we talk about the feminization of education, we're talking about the excessive feminization of institutions and the disavowal of masculine beliefs or masculine coded ideas. Men are being left behind by various metrics. So males are more likely to get suspended at school, they're more likely to drop out from university. And qualitatively, we can tell that boys and men are being alienated in many ways. They feel that they're being unfairly treated, that they're being villainized, and that they're unable to speak up without being treated as misogynists. So the problem actually goes not just towards men, but more to society as a whole as well. Of course, when men suffer, when boys suffer, society as a whole suffers. But also, the growth in feminine coded ideas can cause problems for everybody. So the rise in topics like intersectional feminism, for instance, has led to phenomena like canceling or people demonizing historical oppressor groups. There's also this broader chilling effect where feminine coded ideas being so dominant makes people who disagree with those ideas intimidated to speak out. So I think that broadly covers what I anticipate.
All right. Lorenzo, do you feel like that fairly represents your position?
Yeah, that was good. That was good.
Cool. Let's go into the opening statements then. We'll start with Lorenzo. You have 5 minutes. Would you prefer me raise my hand at 30 seconds or 10 seconds?
30 seconds. Yeah.
30 seconds sounds great. So I'll mute and you just let me know when you're ready to get started. You have 5 minutes.
Okay, I'm gonna start now. So, what am I arguing and what am I not arguing exactly? So, I am not arguing that women are bad teachers, and I am not arguing that femininity has no place in society, nor am I arguing that every female teacher is biased against boys or traditionally masculine traits that show up in boys. And nor am I arguing that every societal problem or every problem that boys face can be traced back to the feminization of educational institutions. I am arguing that our educational institutions have become increasingly feminized in their underlying values, practices, and expectations. And that this has produced, on balance, negative consequences for boys and ultimately for society. What do we mean by feminization? We don't simply mean more women being present in education, more women working in education. We mean a broader institutional shift, namely educational environments increasingly rewarding and prioritizing traits and behaviors that are, on average, more characteristic of girls and women, such as compliance, agreeableness, behavioral conformity, and verbal performance, while giving comparatively less accommodation to traits and behaviors that are on average more characteristic of boys. We define net negative as, on balance, the harms outweighs the benefit. And so my thesis is straightforward. Boys are experiencing educational disadvantages. We see substantial sex differences in educational outcomes, particularly in reading and school attainment. There are studies that confirm this, studies that found girls outperform boys in reading, and with boys more likely to fall below baseline proficiencies. The existence of that gap by itself does not prove that feminization has caused it, but it does establish that there is a real problem that requires explanation. So the problem is real. My second argument is that schools aren't necessarily neutral environments in how they evaluate boys as opposed to girls. There is empirical evidence that teacher evaluation itself can be gender. For example, Camille Terrier's research compared teacher-assigned grades with more objective assessments and found evidence that teachers favored girls in their evaluations. She estimated that this bias explained a substantial portion of boys' relative decline in math, for instance. More recent research has found similar discrepancies between teacher-assigned grades and externally assessed performance. So again, Not to belabor the point, but the point is not that all female teachers are biased against boys. The point is that an institution can systematically disadvantage a group without anyone consciously intending to do so. Another argument is that boys and girls are developmentally different. So there are sex differences, right? In traits, and as far as education is concerned, in traits relevant to classroom functioning. So self-regulation, attention, and behavioral development are different in boys and girls. Girls tend on average to mature earlier in some of these areas. And if an educational environment rewards sustained compliance, verbal performance, organization, and certain forms of self-regulation, then it is entirely reasonable to ask whether that environment serves boys and girls equally well. This brings me to my last point, that the enormous imbalance between men and women in teaching profession, particularly in early education. So men make up a minority of teachers in American K-12 education, and the imbalance is especially pronounced in the early grades. Now, this matters because there is at least a plausible case that boys benefit from access to positive male role models for boys to develop into men. So putting all these points together, the arguments become fairly simple. There are real and substantial problems among boys in the educational field. There is evidence that educational evaluation can be gendered, and we know boys and girls differ on average in traits relevant to classroom behavior and development. And we have an educational institution that is overwhelmingly female, especially at the early stages when children are first being socialized into formal education. My contention is that these things interact. And I have more to say, but I am out of time. So I'm just going to stop here.
Incredible opening statements. Lorenzo, elevator, when you are ready, let me know. Would you prefer 30 seconds or 10 seconds when I raise my hand?
30 seconds. I always miss the little finger waggle.
All right. I'll raise my hand at 30 seconds. You have 5 minutes. Feel free to have a little clock on your side too to kind of help you out. I'll mute and you just let me know when you're ready.
All right, sure, I'll just jump right into it. So I have a few disputes with the claim at hand. So the claim is that the feminization of education has led to a net negative effect for society. So I have three main disputes. So number one, I believe that the claim itself is too vague and virtually unfalsifiable. We first need to define what we mean by feminization. You touched a little bit about the definitions, but you referenced the entry of women into teaching and student positions. We still need to define a time period, a location. We need to define what metrics we're using in order to define what net negative even means, what it looks like. I'll admit the core claim sounds compelling, that the entry of women has caused a systematic disadvantaging of boys and men in education and in wider society. But theoretically, you can make the exact opposite claim and be just as correct in the way that it's currently phrased. My second dispute is that even if we assume that feminization can be defined and that it does cause negative problems, such as the ones you've described, like the fact that self-regulation and attention are fundamentally different in the average boy compared to the average girl, and that currently the education system is not accounting for those population differences, even if I put that aside, my main question would be, what indicates that all of these effects taken together constitute a net negative for society? You mentioned things like educational attainment, and it's true that boys drop out from university and schooling systems more often than girls do, and that there is an educational attainment gap between girls and boys. But broadly speaking, feminized countries tend to have higher rates overall of literacy, of educational attainment more globally. It's true that boys are falling behind compared to girls, but compared to 50 years ago, 100 years ago, there are more boys as a proportion of the population that are being educated compared to previously. And in part, this is thanks to the feminization of the education system, the fact that we've created a standardized method that appears to work for the average person, even if it does sadly leave behind some boys. And finally, my third dispute is more of a meta one. It's how can we attribute these negatives to feminization rather than looking upstream? Now, you mentioned this in my Steelman, or rather in your Steelman of my opening, right? But the claim that the feminization of education is responsible for net negative effects on society makes an implicit subclaim that feminization is a distinct entity. I would argue, though, that culture is always existing downstream of material conditions. The resources and technology changed first, and then the feminization of education followed to match that. So it's impossible to examine the feminization of education without challenging the things that led us here in the first place. There's also some key metrics that we can look at where the feminization of education does seem to actually benefit countries overall. So in addition to what I've previously mentioned, and this leads me to a kind of 3.5 dispute, it seems impossible to discuss the feminization of education without acknowledging the fact that countries, on average, that have a more feminized education system tend to be doing better, and vice versa. Countries that do better tend to converge on a similar education system that can be described as feminine or feminized. So those are my main disputes.
Great stuff. All right. Let's go straight into the rebuttals. Lorenzo, you have 3 minutes. I'm setting the clock. I'll raise my hand in 30 seconds. Just let me know when you're ready. I'll mute.
Okay, I'll just get right into it. So you asked how we define feminization. So feminization, hold on, I have a definition here. Yeah, so not just the fact that there are more women present in the educational sector. As I mentioned in my opening statement, it's a broader institutional shift. So educational environments increasingly rewarding and prioritizing traits and behaviors that are on average more characteristics of girls and women, namely being more agreeable, being more compliant, increased verbal performance, and behavioral conformity. I understand this is an unexhaustive list, but it'll do for now. And so a change in the underpinning philosophy of education, I would argue. You said this claim is unfalsifiable, but I would ask you, how is it unfalsifiable? So we have feminization defined, we have net negative defined. When I say net negative, I mean that the harm on average outweighs the benefit. So, and if you need more definition, I can give them to you. But with all the definitions being present, what do you mean by unfalsifiable? And you ask for a time period. I think if we're looking for a time period, we can look at roughly the past 60 to 70 years with the culture shift that identifies it, because there has been a fundamental shift in value culture-wide. I think we will agree on this, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. So yeah, the past 60 to 70 years. What else did you claim? How does it produce a net negative statement? Because, well, we know that we know that boys are underperforming. We agreed on that, right? Because you mentioned it in your opening. So that's a problem, because, right, what is also a problem is that boys need to spend time around. It's not good for boys to spend the majority of their time around women in their developmental years. All those hours that they are around women, they need to spend time around men as well. Not only from an educational perspective, but from a psychological perspective. For a boy to spend time, a boy needs to spend time around a man in order to develop his masculinity and to have a male role model that he can look up to. So there's that. you said more boys are being educated despite the feminization of education, and that is true, but I would argue that the cause for that is because there are more people in the education system, and because education is more readily accessible today than it was compared to 50 years ago. So yeah, that's all from me.
All right. Elevator. I'm resetting the clock. I'll raise my hand at 30 seconds. Just let me know when you're ready.
All right. I think I can tackle it. Police is coming after me. Okay, so you've touched on a few of the points that I asked about in my opening argument, so thank you for that. The question remains, so one of the points you brought up was, well, how is my claim unfalsifiable, as I've defined the terms feminization and net negative? I am still unsure about what the end goal is. I think that's my fundamental dispute with the claim. So if the claim is that the feminization of education is leading to a net negative for society, that kind of implies that there's a way of calculating what net negative means. So that implies that you have a metric in mind of male happiness or female happiness, societal happiness, which I think is still yet to be defined. You've touched on some metrics, but overall, I wouldn't say that they necessarily constitute a net negative for society. I would say a better claim may be that the feminization of education has hurt boys and men in specific ways, such as the educational attainment gap. But even then, as I mentioned, on a population level scale, I struggle to see the ways in which boys and men are underperforming relative to 50 to 60 years ago. Now, you've mentioned that over 60 to 70 years is the time span you're looking at. So we can look to the last 60 to 70 years at specific metrics of interest that come up in these kinds of discussions. So for one, we can look at literacy rates. As mentioned, those have broadly increased, not just in the US, but globally. We can look at things like, well, I suppose birth rates have generally been doing pretty badly for everyone globally, but this seems to be decoupled from the feminization of education, as we see in countries like Morocco and Russia and Poland, which skew more conservative, either more recently or historically. It doesn't really seem like the influx of feminine coded ideas can be tied very convincingly to our worse birth rates. We can look to metrics like overall happiness, which generally has gotten better over time and tends to be better in countries that have more feminized education systems. We can look to Iceland, the Netherlands, Finland. And these are countries that, broadly speaking, score very highly in the gender equality indices that you can look at and generally have higher happiness levels. So this brings me back to the core question, which is what are the metrics that we can look at to really tell whether society is worse off as a result of the feminization of education?
Great. We have the 10-minute open discussion. I'll mute as soon as someone starts engaging. I'll start the clock. And then I'll raise my hand when there's 1 minute left. Does that sound fair?
See?
Yeah, all right.
Cool. All right, here we go.
All right, so as for the metrics that you asked about, I'm not really sure. I mean, we already know that boys are scoring way worse on things like math and reading proficiency, which I would say is in itself a measure. And other than that, I would say the discussion might be less about educational outcomes, although it's also about that, like it's an important point. But it's also about what impact, what the developmental impact that a feminized environment has on boys, which I would argue is pretty bad for the reasons that I already mentioned. So
Yeah, thank you for that. So I guess for the first one, I'll lock in on that metric. Because I think that's pretty informative, right? Like if boys are generally performing worse in maths, I think that's pretty bad for society as a whole. Um, that said, it does seem like it's a reverse like correlation, right? I mean, from everything that I've seen in preparation for this debate, men actually outnumber women in various STEM disciplines. I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing, but it seems that men are actually doing pretty well in STEM as compared to girls. And if we're sticking to that time span of 60 to 70 years, then essentially the claim boils down to are boys and men worse now at maths and English and related topics than they were 60 to 70 years ago. And I personally have not seen that anywhere. I think that generally the consensus globally is that over time people are getting better at education, they have more tools, technology is more widespread. So whether you like it or not, you're going to get exposed to maths or English in some way. And that helps with education. As for the second part, I think the feminized environment being generally bad for boys, again, I don't necessarily disagree that boys should be exposed to male role models and should have strong male role models in their lives. But how to attribute that to the feminization of education? I mean, if the claim is that boys don't have male role models, then is it really the fault of women choosing to join teaching professions? Is it really the feminization of education which is to blame? And if it is, I'm also interested in hearing what the solution is.
Yeah. So let me start from your last point. So no,
Yeah.
it's not entirely the feminization of education, but it's certainly part of it. Because in public schools, it's like how many hours a day do kids spend in public schools? It's a substantial part of the day. So, and hold on, I'm lost. So it's at least part of it. And as for the solution which you asked about, honestly, I'm not sure. I don't have like the means. I don't have any suggestions as to that, but I would say education by itself is or has become a field that especially allures to women because of women's nature. So
Sure.
and maybe an increase in maybe an increase in activities that are more appealing to boys and to men's nature. That could be part of it. You said men outnumber women in STEM. Now that is true. The vast majority of engineers are men, but that's because in order to become an engineer, you have to be more interested in things, right? The vast majority of engineers are men. The vast majority of nurses are women, and that's because in order to become an engineer, you have to be especially interested in things, and in order to be a nurse, you have to be especially interested in people. And men are, on average, more interested in things, and women are, on average, more interested in people. So that's my response to that.
Okay. I'll come back to the feminized environment point in a bit, but just to talk about this. So we've established that the majority of like STEM disciplines tends to appeal to men more. The majority of men tend to be more interested in things rather than people, which leads people. I'll take that for granted, right? Now, my my question is then, if men are free to pursue their interests in mathematical disciplines, and they tend to be overperforming relative to 60 to 70 years ago in across different educational metrics, what is the struggle? Is
That's
it purely to do with the emotional side of not being able to connect to male role models?
No, I wouldn't say the educational aspect has anything to do with it. And honestly, I don't have an answer to this question. Like, I couldn't tell you that.
That's fine.
There's also, but another thing to take into account, though, is the fact that men are dropping out of universities at an astonishing rate, way more than women. So there's something else to take into account. And Yeah.
So I would agree that it's a shame that boys and men drop out of university, that they're being reprimanded just for being disruptive in school, that oftentimes male coded behaviors are being punished just because they don't fit into the rigid academic structure that's like that's present in most primary and secondary school environments. Um, but honestly, from what I've seen, this seems like a trend that persists internationally. It seems divorced from any um, feminized education trends that we see. I mean, typically, when you look at uh, male dropout rates, they don't seem to be influenced too much, at least from what I've seen, by the proportion of women in their cohorts. And if I recall correctly, men and women tend to become university lecturers at about the same rate. So if we're looking at university, like higher education dropout rates, it doesn't seem like there's a clear correlation between too many too many women in lecturer positions and boys dropping out. It seems like maybe the issue is either further upstream, so somewhere within, I don't know, somewhere else within culture, maybe something else in biology. I wouldn't know. Um, this actually brings me back to the feminized environment thing. So again, I do think it's a shame that a lot of boys don't have older male role models to look to. Um, but the only way that I can see being able to introduce more male teachers within those spaces and give boys the male role models they need is DI, basically, like male DI, which I'm not opposed to either. Like, I think if you can make a good case for why we should prioritize male hiring in teaching positions, then that's fine. But I find that typically DEI measures will lead to a lot of backlash and are unsustainable in the long run. So I suppose it should be down to the parents to provide those male role models, unless we can really change the school system in a way that attracts more men to teaching positions. But I suspect that's not possible.
Right. Let's take a step back, because it seems to me like we agree on quite a bit, actually.
Yep.
Now the fact that there is an approximately equal ratio of male to female university teachers, that doesn't necessarily negate that boys are falling behind.
Of course.
And and to answer your point, no, I would not argue in favor of the. I would never do that in a million years. I think.
Okay.
I think we have. It's more. This problem needs to be addressed from the cultural perspective, from a cultural angle, but that is outside the scope of this conversation. So outside of this, it seems to me like we agree on quite a bit.
I think we do agree on I think that I'm more black pilled potentially about the reasons for
Yeah,
cultural decline. I think that
yeah,
it's actually nothing to do with cultural phenomena like the feminization of education. I feel like all of all of these are symptoms of a broader trend, not even necessarily problems. So like, okay, to give a bit of insight on my perspective with like how to change education, for example, I don't see a way in which you can create a system that works and doesn't require favoring agreeableness. Because fundamentally, the
when you say,
education system.
hold on a second, when you say that works, you mean increasing the male presence in education? Is that what you mean?
So yeah, that's actually a good good question. So basically, if you want to patch certain problems, like boys dropping out of school, boys being suspended at a higher rate than girls, and let's say that there's a way to adjust the educational system to address those, like even if there is a way of addressing those issues, I think it's going to break something else in the system. For example, you could
I agree.
start.
I
Yeah.
agree that if you throw a wrench in the wheel, everything else is gonna follow from that. So
Yeah. Like,
so I'm not even sure what we're arguing at this point.
I mean, this is usually the end spot. Oh, you're muted, yeah.
10 minutes is up, yeah?
All
Is there
right.
anything left unsaid that y'all want to get out before we move on?
I'm good.
I'll probably like yap later, so let's just
Okay.
move it. Yeah.
All good. All right, let's go to the Q&A. We'll just, try to do a minute or two for each response. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions. The first one goes to Lorenzo. This is, do you believe it's primarily about the personality type of the teachers, or is it femininity, like in general? That's the first question for you.
I would argue it's both, although there can be a lot of variation within the feminine temperament itself. Yeah, the prevalence of femininity in education is absolutely a net negative, in my opinion. And so, yeah, the problem is femininity by itself, I would argue. Yeah, but I'm not trying to argue that there is, as I said in my opening, I'm not trying to argue that there is no place for femininity in society. I think I kind of already exhausted. I think I've already answered this question in the discussion. So, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, that might happen. The second question for you, Lorenzo. Do you think by feminizing education, it has subordinated uncomfortable truths that don't align with the feminist imperative and essentially hiding elements of history to serve the feminist agenda?
Definitely. Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think female teachers have a way higher likelihood compared to male teachers to spread political propaganda in the classroom. And that includes feminism. That happens all the time. So that is definitely the case. So why don't you repeat to me the question, see if I can give you a better answer.
Sorry, what'd you say?
Why don't you repeat the question, see if I can give you a
Yes.
better answer.
Got you. I mean, that was a sufficient answer. I'd be curious to hear what Elevator says after this. But the
Okay.
question is, if you want to keep answering, I'll let you keep answering, Lorenzo. I'll repeat it. Do you think by feminizing education, it has subordinated uncomfortable truths that don't align with the feminist imperative and essentially hiding elements of history to serve the feminist agenda?
Yeah, okay. You can let Elevator respond.
Cool. What do you think, Elevator? Do you think that the feminization of education is possibly hiding elements of history to serve the feminist agenda?
Maybe. Yeah. Seems like it's happened.
Okay.
I can basically.
Can anybody substantiate this? Yes or no? With any examples or anything like that?
I mean, recently, if you want to, RIP, by the way, we could talk about Jason Arday, the recent very high profile case within University of Cambridge, where um, a professor was criticized essentially for being brought in on DEI grounds more so than on the strength of his actual merit. This can be argued to be a kind of like, and there was a extensive campaign to try to vindicate him on the part of Cambridge. You can argue that this is like a symptom of the broader issue that people have an agenda first, institutions have an agenda first, and they will just even bad decisions to protect that agenda. So that's just like one recent example off the top of my head. It seems to happen.
Yeah, which
Is it
isn't
a
even necessarily feminization as it is Marxism in the educational sector.
Okay. Well, yeah, I was gonna ask, can we break down the chain here? So it's like
yeah?
feminization of education happened, and then that led to the DEI, and then that led to this person being hired? Or what's the causal chain here? Is it Marxism first, Marx and Engels,
It's
and then
it's kind of
feminism,
a chicken
and then
it's kind of a chicken and egg problem with all
yeah,
the with all the issues reinforcing one another. So
Yeah, that's what I'm curious. That's what I'm curious about. If anyone has any opinions on it, I think that was a pretty good question to try to figure out a little bit of something. But it's interesting that the question was like, is someone intentionally preventing people from understanding important things about history? At least that's how I understood the question.
I have more. I have
Okay.
so many thoughts on this actually. Now that you okay, so
Go for it.
initially I understood the question as being like, is it possible that the feminization of education leads to a systematic like suppression of ideas? And I'm thinking, well, yeah, there's plenty of examples of that, individually speaking. It's definitely possible. Then now, from your retelling of the question, if the person who asked the question is asking, well, is there a conspiracy? Are there people who are deliberately trying to push their agendas? I would say, okay, yes, but at this point, I feel it would be remiss for me to ignore the fact that, like, guys, let's look at how we got to this point in the first place, right? I mean, the feminization of education didn't pop out of nowhere. It's not like we got a bunch of feminists that suddenly decided, I'm actually going to make a difference in the world. This is like downstream of labor markets changing to favorize more intellectual jobs that are kind of feminine coded more so than masculine coded jobs. This is like downstream of like 100 years of technology and like basically institutions being allowed to be more nerdy than being more masculine, and as a result of that attracting more women. I wouldn't say it's a conspiracy, I'd say it's natural selection.
Okay, like a cool.
yeah,
Lorenzo,
well,
any more thoughts?
yeah, well, you gotta ask yourself, why has feminism basically conquered the culture only over the past 100 years? So feminism is a way more ancient phenomenon, right? Goes back to the beginning of humankind, basically. So why has it only become prevalent in the past century? Because technological advancement, rendered possible and maintained by men, allows women to call themselves and conduct themselves in what we what we what we generally call boss babes. So to
Sorry,
pretend to
boys.
pretend that they don't need men, but no, women depend on their survival for men.
So I've heard this kind of before, and I don't dispute that women's survival depends on men. I just think that it's like a 50% of the equation, right? I mean, men also depend on the survival of men depends on women. It's
The
kind of
survival of
an
humankind, you mean?
well, survive. Yeah, I mean, the survival of everyone depends on everyone essentially. Um, I essentially I reject the premise of like either one being more important in the equation. It's just kind of like, well, whoever wins. As for it being a recent phenomenon, absolutely. I think that the reason why people are allowed to go to university now, not just like women, but like the average person being allowed to go to university now is thanks to technological advancement, giving people the privilege to pursue intellectual work rather than shitty manual work. And I mean, I'm happy with this arrangement personally. But then again, I would be, right? Because I don't get much fulfillment from lifting weights and beating people up or working in the fields. So like this arrangement works very well for me, and I imagine it works very well for a lot of people, seeing as countries that have more feminized nerdy cultures tend to do better. Um, yeah, like sucks for people who do enjoy manual labor, I guess.
Let's move on to the next question.
Oh, right, yeah.
I think that was a really good exploration of that one. Next one is for both. We'll start with Lorenzo. Is feminism the political arm of a spiritual movement?
Absolutely, 100%. 100%. I have no doubts on that. Elevator doesn't agree. Yeah,
All right.
it's definitely the case. It's well, I guess you could say that either feminism is an offshoot of Marxism or the other way around or both. But feminism is definitely, what would you say? So it it, it implicitly embraces fundamentally Marxist ideas, right? Uh, Marxism is embedded into the structure of feminism itself. And it doesn't just go for feminism, it goes for all the isms, transgenderism, leftism, you name it. So that is definitely the case. And yes, it is spiritual. It is absolutely a spiritual battle.
Okay. Elevator, what do you have to say? Is feminism the political arm of a spiritual movement?
There's a charitable interpretation of the question, which is that are there people who have spiritual goals and feminism is a means to their spiritual goals? Sure, sure. I'd agree with that. Then there's a less charitable reading of the question, which is feminism a spiritual ideology? And I think we're really stretching the definition of spiritual at this point. I mean, if in the same way that ideologies in general are spiritual, sure, but then is like capitalism a spiritual ideology? Is belonging to the Conservative Party a spiritual idea? Well, I guess like in a manner of speaking, but I I feel like we're stretching the definition quite thin there. So short answer, yes. Long answer, what do you mean by that?
Great. Let's go to the next one. We'll start with Lorenzo. It says, maybe it's the administrative bloat that has led to feminization, or is the feminization leading to the administrative bloat? Or maybe they're the same thing.
Yeah, they're probably the same thing. I think the initial outburst of feminization into the culture led to the administrative bloat and the bureaucracy and all the bureaucracy and HR departments. All of these things which I just named are quintessentially feminine in spirit and scope, right? So that's definitely the case. And yeah, I mean there are many jobs which are completely useless, worse than useless. They are actively damaging, like HR. HR is damaging to everyone, especially men, and those positions are occupied are majority women. So yeah, that's my answer.
Elevator, your thoughts? Let me know if I need to reread the question.
Yes, please, if you could.
Okay, it says maybe it's the administrative bloat that has led to feminization, or is the feminization leading to the administrative bloat, or maybe they're the same thing.
I think I'd lean towards what Lorenzo said about them being the same thing. I mean, I kind of okay, short answer, yes, again, and then long answer, this isn't the right question to be asking, I don't think. But I mean, for the reasons described earlier. Like I think that the really the administrative bloat and feminization, based on our earlier definition, it seems like they're like one to one. The question is then the more interesting question, in my opinion, is then, well, what led to both? What led to either?
I would argue it's the cultural shift.
But why do you think the cultural shift happened?
That's a good question. It all goes back to an Italian man named Antonio Gramsci.
Okay. It's
Oh.
this
Maybe
guy.
you heard the story.
Nope.
Well, he basically came up with the idea that in order for communism to win, he has to influence culture. He has to become hand in glove with the culture, which is what we have seen over the past 60 years. Yeah, Antonio Gramsci was put in prison by Mussolini, the Italian fascist dictator, and he was allowed to write while he was in prison, and that's where he wrote his manifesto, let's call it. That's where he came up with this idea. So the cultural shift, we owe it not solely, but in large part to him.
Um, I I instinctively very much disagree. I think this is like
Okay.
the only times where I'm
Okay.
like, Okay, here's my first principles rationale for thinking this. Nothing in history happens because of one guy.
That's
Even
not what I
if you
said.
sure. But I'm describing my first principles, like rationale for
Okay.
why I disagree. So nothing in history happens just due to one guy. There's an infinite causal chain that you can trace back between and consequence upwards through history. I think that the primary lever for cultural change is always going to be biology and technology. What we see probably, I mean, I think I understand your point that Antonio Gramsci is a key figure within Marxism who essentially proposed that if you want, you first need cultural dominance, and then down from him, we have this current idea of like we need to install people within positions of cultural power in order to attain political dominance. Sure, like people have been doing this forever. The question remains, why did Antonio Gramsci win where everyone else was doing the same thing? In a system where you have competitors all competing for political power, why is it that you think he won? Because he's not the only guy who happens to realize that
What,
people vote for the guys they like, right?
what do you mean when you say he won?
So,
He didn't do anything special other than coming up with the idea that I just presented. So
but he didn't come up with it, right?
yeah, he did.
What was the idea that,
That
can you,
in order for communism to win, to become prevalent, to truly conquer a country, economics is not enough because Marx focused himself largely on economics, right? Marxism needs to conquer the culture itself, so it needs to infiltrate all the institutions, the media, the education, etc.
I think the only weakness of the claim there is how do you know that he's the human who entered that thought onto the planet Earth and that we haven't already been coming to this conclusion before him? I think that's
Oh,
probably
well,
where it needs some clarity.
I think it seems like throughout history, this is just exactly the same. I mean, respect to Gramsci, I think this is common sense, right? Like the idea that in order to attain political power, you need to infiltrate like institutions bit by bit. This is just,
As Machiavelli is very established in that, and I think he's before Gramsci.
yeah, definitely.
I
A few
mean,
centuries before, yeah.
you can look to, I mean, I'm on a Rome kick at the moment, so you can look to like the rise of Caesar to power. I mean, he definitely understood like
But
the
he,
necessity.
but Lorenzo still has a point, though. That could be the most recent major like influence on this current culture. Was just, I mean, you know, to the other question, maybe feminism isn't teaching history fully, and so we're not going back and reaching into those ancient Greek, or we're not learning about Machiavelli. I mean, who's learning about Machiavelli in high school and primary school? Maybe we're learning about this
Lesbian dance
Italian.
theory.
There you go. Maybe we're learning about other things, and that's influencing a lot. And maybe that thing stems closer to this set of ideas. And so I think that argument could go that direction. All right. For the sake of time, is there anything final that we need to say on that question?
I'm
No,
good.
but more broadly, I
One
have
more
my own.
question. It has two parts. I'll read it and we can go into it. Does the feminization of education contribute directly to a less interested male demographic? The second part looks like, do we take the fierce masculine strength out of education by making it less masculine?
Can you repeat the last
So,
part?
yeah, it says, do we take the fierce masculine strength out of education by making it less masculine?
Probably, yeah.
Okay, and then does the feminization of education contribute directly to a less interested demographic?
I would argue that is the case, yeah. If you, yeah, if boys are more, if boys are taught from an early age to focus on, I phrased it wrong. If boys take on more feminine activity from an early age, that is, well, for one thing, that can be demoralizing. For another, that is more likely to make them less interested in education in general. So,
Any thoughts, Elevator?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah. Does the feminization of education contribute directly to a less interested male demographic?
Yeah,
Right there.
I think that makes sense. Sure. I mean, essentially, the question is asking, is it possible there is a direct causal link between guys being in a feminized environment and being less happy? Yeah, for sure.
I'm fascinated to hear what has y'all convinced that men would be less interested in this feminine atmosphere? What could you point to a specific behavior that a man would be asked? It sounds like maybe you're saying a male, a child, is being asked to do a specific behavior, and because they're being asked to do it, they're upset or they don't want to participate. Or could you all help me understand exactly what that is?
I will give you a silly example to make this point. So
Yeah,
if you take
good.
the Boy Scouts, which have been feminized too, now the Boy Scouts focus on stuff like, like drawing or just, activities that entail sitting in a classroom and doing something. Uh, you know, whereas boys want to go on adventures. They want to build stuff. They want to spend time outside as opposed to inside. So yeah, that's,
Well,
I think.
I noticed you. I noticed you just assert the idea that they've now focused on this, and I don't keep up with the Boy Scouts, but I imagine the Boy Scouts added that. This is just me assuming. I
Mhm.
imagine they added that dimension, and they didn't eliminate all of the other foraging and
Well,
making fires.
I couldn't give you a complete overview. This is something I heard from Matt Walsh, but I think it's accurate, and I think that, yeah, it exemplifies the phenomenon and it answers the question.
I think it makes sense that they would add that. I don't know about eliminate the rest of the practices. That's an interesting claim I'll have to look into further. Elevator, do you have any more insight on this question?
Yeah, I was just thinking about how to phrase my I take because okay, the reason I responded with sure is because I can imagine 100+ ways in which a boy with a specific temperament would not like the modern education system. Lots of boys are hyperactive. Lots of boys would not want to be in history class for like 1 hour. I know some of these boys from growing up. So absolutely, a feminized education environment can be suboptimal for various personality types. But if you were to ask me the reverse of like, well, is it possible that girls suffer in the current educational system? I would give you the same answer. Sure. Just depends on the kid. On average, probably it makes sense. Given different stats on how boys are underperforming, I think it is totally fair to say that the current education system is suboptimal for more boys than it is suboptimal for girls.
All right. That concludes the Q&A section. Just want to say y'all are doing, incredible. I love this
Danke.
debate. Now let's go into the closing statements. You each have 3 minutes. Lorenzo, you will be our first, giving your closing statement. Let me reset the clock. I'll raise my hand at 30 seconds like we have been doing. I'll mute. Just let me know when to start.
All right. So, to bring this back to the question we started with, I think feminization has had a net negative effect on society. I think there is evidence that supports this, along with common sense. and things that we can all notice? I think all of this gives us good reason to answer yes. So I don't think boys are simply experiencing isolated anecdotal difficulties. And I think schools aren't necessarily a neutral environment for boys. We know that teacher evaluations can differ by sex, and there is evidence that girls can receive more favorable evaluations compared to boys when more objective measures do not show the same difference. Again, boys and girls are developmentally different, sometimes very different. The differences are on average in characteristics relevant to the classroom behavior and self-regulation. If an institution places an especially heavy emphasis on compliance, organization, and verbal performance, and other forms of behavior that align more closely with the average developmental profile of girls, then we should not be surprised if boys aren't served equally well by their environment. Lastly, we have an education system in which men aren't, I'm not going to say, I was going to say underrepresented, but I don't want to go into DEI. We've already discussed this. So, I don't think simply hiring more men is a solution. To be truthful with you, I don't have a solution, but that does not mean a solution does not exist. And if a solution does exist, it's definitely not DEI. So, yeah, I'm gonna close it there.
Great. Let me reset the clock. Elevator, you have 3 minutes. I'll mute. I'll raise my hand at 30 seconds. Just let me know.
Okay, I'll try to ad-lib this. So, the crux of the claim seems to be that the feminization of education can be traced back as the cause for why we're seeing these negative effects in boys and men. For some of those, I think that's a realistic link to draw, right? We see boys generally being more hyperactive and not being able to focus in class as much as girls. We see that boys are more likely to be diagnosed with mental disorders or disabilities for which they need special education. But my main issue with the claim at hand is that the link is overstated. There's this part of the claim, the net negative part of the claim, that I think is the hardest to defend. I think that it's totally fair to say that the feminization of education has led to some negatives for society. But in order to make the claim that the feminization of education has led to a net negative for society, you're appealing to a kind of counterfactual that we just don't have. And in fact, the evidence we do have is that, broadly speaking, the feminization of education is good, if not inevitable. Countries with feminized education systems tend to perform better across GDP, across happiness indices, and this includes the well-being of both women and men. Conversely, we see that countries that have less feminized education systems and have suppressed feminism or other ideologies that we consider feminine coded, they're not performing particularly well either. So, is the current system likely to be suboptimal for boys? Sure, absolutely. And the data supports that much. And on a meta level, this is where I take a step back and think, isn't this exactly the same argument that like DEI people make? Essentially what we're saying is we need to change a suboptimal system because it's suboptimal. There's a demographic that is being disadvantaged, and regardless of what has led us to this point, we need to correct for that disadvantaging. Now, solution is up in the air, so that's fine. But this line of thinking is reminiscent of the very thing that it's critiquing, right? I mean, earlier we were talking about Marxism. Isn't this whole debate kind of Marxist coded? Like the idea of centering the feminization of education as the enemy here kind of ignores all the things that led up to it. Isn't culture just natural selection at work? And if so, Why should we dispute this? Is it a coincidence that all countries tend to converge on gender equality? Is it a coincidence that the feminization of education is so widespread? I mean, it doesn't seem likely. Maybe it is. In 100 years' time, I'm totally open to the fact that we're going to revert right back to where we were 200 years ago. And, sucks for me, I guess. But the whole conversation seems to be focusing a little further downstream than where it should be looking. By centering culture, you're kind of falling into the same trap that people criticize Marxists of falling into. You're centering a demographic rather than the material conditions that lead to the situation you're finding yourself in. I think those are my final thoughts.
Wonderful. That concludes the debate.
Could I
Thank you to
could I
both
respond
sides.
to a couple of the points that she made there in the conclusion? I don't mean to reignite the debate, just
It's a
respond to a
very
couple of points that
controversial
she made that in her closing statement, if you don't mind.
Sure, if y'all have the time. Yeah, let's
Just
do it. It's a little
couple
unusual.
quick things. So
Sure.
you said that societies naturally tend toward equality. Now, I actually agree with a lot of what you said in your closing statement. You said societies naturally tend toward equality. I don't think it's exactly true. I think the equality, or at least the semblance of it, that we see in Western societies, Western countries today, is largely due to the other element which you mentioned, which is Marxism. You also said that that culture is the result of natural selection, and I would argue that it's true to some extent. But the technological advancements that we've made over the past 100 years have largely interfered with that. And I think we've seen, like the invention of the pill, for instance, and that's why culture looks the way it does today. So
sorry, I didn't catch that word. The invention of
the pill,
what?
the birth control pill.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure. Absolutely, yeah. I think technological advancement has enabled philosophies like, well, feminist ideology and Marxism to persist. But I guess what I mean by natural selection is more in a broader sense. It's not that we've interfered with. I'm not saying that like Marxists happen to be like reproducing more than non-Marxists per se. I'm saying that cultural ideas go through selection processes. The best ideas or the most popular ideas tend to persist. Less popular ideas tend to be filtered out. I think rather than trying to combat Marxism by saying the idea is bad and we need to replace it, we need to look at why it became popular in the first place. I would argue that people aren't becoming feminist or they're converging on these ideas like for a random reason. It's the context. It's the context in which those ideas live, which make them popular. People have realized that. I mean, just look at university, right? It's thanks to the invention of things like different container ships that we've shifted from manual labor to intellectual labor primarily. It's no wonder that people are shifting towards masculine professions to feminine ones. It's because we don't really need masculine skills in the same way that we did before. We still need them, and it's a shame that a lot of people's natural talents are being squandered, but I hope that adds clarification.
Yeah, we agree on a lot, and I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, sure.
Awesome. That concludes the debate. Thank you to both sides for a thoughtful exchange, and thank you to everyone listening.